Hello, everyone. Thank you for sticking up to this late. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Gregory Sonnier. I'm going to talk about plant diversity in grazing land and its relationship with plant productivity. A big shout out first to Betsy Boughton, which really spearheaded this project and also organized a really great organized session during the last ESA, where the topic was biodiversity in agroecosystem. We use our draw. So first things, why are we looking at grazing land? As you may all know, grazing lands are providing important ecosystem services. The most obvious is it supports livestock. So a lot of provisioning services are coming from grazing land. And the other, probably less known, is that it can also provide carbon sequestration. There are ecosystems where carbon sequestration is quite important. Another reason why I was interested in looking at grazing land, beside the fact that I work at Buck Island Ranch, is very often grazing lands are perceived as low diversity and very homogeneous in terms of plant species composition. But if you look closer, you will realize that across geographical region and a different spatial scale, it's not necessarily the case. And for example, this is an image of some of the species that we have at Buck Island Ranch. And we have been maintaining a species list for many years now. And we have, at this point, more than 400 plant species that have been recorded in our herbarium throughout the ranch, which include like some typical pasture species, seasonal wetland species, or like species that we will find only in hammock. And when we look at this diversity, we can ask different questions. Is diversity benefiting associated with higher productivity? And is high diversity is associated with high stability? And those questions have been answered in the past, or like they tried to be answered in the past using like experimental, fully factorial design experiment where species diversity was manipulated. But there are far less studies that looked at natural system to answer that kind of questions. And so our first objective was to answer whether or not plant diversity influenced ecosystem productivity in grazing land. And we had two different hypotheses. The first hypothesis is that more diverse and more heterogeneous plant communities would be associated to higher productivity. And our second hypothesis is that more diverse and more heterogeneous plant communities would be associated to higher stability in productivity. The other important thing to realize is that grazing land are often managed by human. And of course, the type of management that will occur on these land will have an influence on the ecosystem they provide. And if we look at Florida, an example in Florida, we have like three broad type of pastures. We have on one hand, on the left side of this slide, what we call native rangeland, which site that have not been fertilized, where the low stocking density, rather like drainage was not really happening that much in there. And then at the far opposite, we have what we call highly managed pastures or improved pasture. These pastures have been fertilized with N and P in the past, and they continue to be fertilized with N, but not with P right now, at least at Buck Island Ranch. They were heavily drained. They were heavily planted with productive grasses, like the most common one is Paspalum notatum, Bahia grass, and they support higher stocking density. And in between those two extremes, you have what we call semi-native or semi-natural pasture, which were never fertilized. They were drained, but less intensively. And there you have an intermediate stocking density. So the second objective was like to determine whether pasture management affect the relationship between plant diversity and productivity in Florida subtropical grazing land. And we had two hypotheses again. The first was to look at what are the patterns of diversity across these three types of management. And we hypothesized that diversity and homogeneity would be higher in rangeland compared to highly intensively managed pasture, and semi-native pasture would be kind of intermediate. Our other hypothesis was that productivity would be higher in highly managed pasture, but that the productivity in those highly managed pasture would be more sensitive to climate anomalies. And we'll go back to what I mean by climate anomalies later. How did we do that? So we really needed like a big data set across the US with plant diversity data. And we actually look for that data in two different networks. As you may know, we are part of the long-term agroecosystem research network, the LTAR or LTAR. And we acquire some data from that network, but primarily most of the data that I'm going to show you today is from a different network, which is the National Ecological Observatory Network, NEON network. And the common feature of all those two networks is that they measure plant diversity following the same exact protocols. And we selected only of the sites in NEON that would be categorized as working land or that had a history of livestock grazing at some point. So the method they used for plant surveys was a modified Whittaker plot. Like, you don't need to know all the details, just measuring plant diversity at different spatial scale. The lower spatial scale is 1 meter square, then we go up to 10 meters square, then 100 meters square, and 400 meters square. Why do we need this? Is to build what we call species area relationship or species area curve, which you have an example here on this slide coming from one of our sites at Buck Ranch, where you see like you have an increase in species richness as you increase area that is sampled. And it's very often a nice power function, and we can, by taking the log of this relationship, we can assess the slope, so which tells you how quickly species accumulate in the landscape. So based on these, we calculated the diversity at 1 meter square, and then the degree to which, like that slope, which tells us something about the heterogeneity of the habitat. The second data that we needed was data on productivity. And because most of the LTAR and NEON site didn't have data on biomass measured manually for a long time, we decided to go with remote sense data. And we acquired what we call gross primary productivity. And I'm just going to use productivity from now on, it's faster. And we use a specific data set that it's available in Google Earth Engine that covers the period from 1986 to 2018. And the advantage of this data set is it has a high resolution of 30 by 30 meter. It's available every 16 days. And so because of that, we can estimate gross primary productivity at each site from the NEON network, LTAR network that we selected. The problem of this method is it's an indirect measure of productivity. And I have an example of like the annual and the seasonal and annual variation in gross primary productivity on this slide. And at the bottom in orange, we have an example coming from like CPR, which is a short grass prairie site. And the blue one is Buck Island Ranch with a subtropical grassland. As you can see, productivity is higher in Florida than it is in those short grass prairies in Colorado. We also acquired another series of data that, and over covariates, the most important ones are rainfall and temperature. We acquired those through a different data set available in Google Earth Engine for each site that we have in our data set. Once again, it covered the same period, except that this time the resolution is a bit bigger. So there is a possible overlap between sites which would have the same rainfall and temperature value, because each NEON site and LTAR site have multiple plots, Whittaker plots within them, that can be close enough that they are within that same cell for that data set. And the other important variable we collected was the Palmer Drought Severity Index, which is a drought severity index that was available thrice monthly, and it covered the same period again. We also looked at effect of vegetation class, latitude and longitude, and elevation. So what we did is like to calculate the slope of the species area curve for E, and we got that for multiple years and take the mean over the years for when site had multiple years of data. we took the productivity data and calculated mean annual productivity for each of the site, each of the plots. And to look at variability in productivity, we calculated the coefficient of variation in annual productivity for all the periods. And we plugged that into generalized linear mixed model. Our response variable was first step was to look at mean annual temperature and relate it to our diversity metrics, vegetation class, latitude, precipitation, PDSI, which is our Palmer drought severity index, as one step. And the second step was to look at coefficient of variation in productivity. So our variable is productivity through time, through the years, and related to the same covariates. And then proceed with model selection using AIC. So first result I want to show you is like nothing really extraordinary that you would probably expect. That is here. This histogram is showing you like each of the site that we had data for. And so the higher the bar, the higher the productivity. And as you can see, BIR stands for Archbold Biological Station Buck Island Ranch. So it's our site as the highest productivity of all the sites that we had in our data set. At the opposite, Jornada, which is located in New Mexico, is the lowest in terms of productivity. And there is a big trend here where it's like its productivity seems to be determined by rainfall or wet condition, like with wetter site having a higher productivity than drier site. Not surprising. Now, when we try to look at all these covariates together, here, as you can see, this table is showing you some of the top models that we observed, that we tested for this study. And so as you can see, like multiple models kind of have similar weights. So that we don't have a clear model that seems to be the best at explaining the variation we observe in our data set. But if we looked at the effect of species richness, which is showed on the right side of this graphic, you can see there is a tendency for sites that have higher species richness at the local scale at 1 meter square to be associated with higher gross primary productivity. But that effect is, as you can see, very weak. Now, what about the variation?
Just a couple of minutes left. Greg, you have just a couple minutes. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So variation in stability, you can see here that Jornada, who had the lowest productivity, is also the less stable. So there is a large variation in productivity over the years in that site, while Buck Island Ranch, which is at the opposite this time on the right end of this graphic, is showing the least amount of variation in productivity through time. And if we look again at our model selection, once again, we don't have a clear model that's doing a lot better than the others, but some of those models include both our slope of the SAR and the species richness at 1 meter square. And as you can see on this graphic on the right, is like, as you increase species richness at the 1 meter square scale, you also decrease that coefficient of variation in productivity. So you going to higher diversity is associated with more stable communities. Once again, we don't expect a lot of the variation in our data, so it's a weak effect. So the lesson learned here is like, let's move on because I don't have much time. And then, so the second aspect was to look at pasture management in Florida grazing land. And as you can see here, the big message of this slide is that diversity is higher at the 1 meter square scale and accumulate faster in native ranch than in highly managed pasture and semi-native. What was surprising is that productivity, although it was higher in highly managed pasture, when we looked at relationship between productivity and drought indexed, we realized that the highly managed pasture tended to be less stable through time and also more sensitive to droughts. So the lesson learned here is that intensively managed pasture are more productive despite being less diverse. So it's kind of like opposite to what we observe across the network. And here it could be due to just a species effect, due to the fact that Paspalum notatum was specifically chosen to be a high productive species, and also due to fertilization history in intensively managed pastures. And the second thing is that intensively managed pasture are less stable and more sensitive to climate anomalies than rangelands. And to finish, I would like to thank everybody at Archbold Biological Station and everybody at the ranch